The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what is the future of populism in Canada? Then we speak to a group of millionaires that wants to raise taxes on millionaires. That's ahead on the agenda. Over 19 seasons of the agenda, populism has reared its head in one form or another, from the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 to the Freedom Convoy in 2022 that brought our nation's capital to a standstill. Now, with so-called technocrat Mark Carney and the Liberals triumphing in this year's federal election, how have populist movements and impulses changed? And in what ways could they shape our politics going forward? To discuss, we're joined by, in Gananoque, Ontario, Lawrence Leduc, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. In Waterloo, Ontario, Besma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo and a Senior Fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. And here in our studio, Carmen Celestini, full-time lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Waterloo, which we've discovered before going on the air is so big that Besma and Carmen actually don't know each other all that well, even though they're at the same institution.
It's true.
So we love bringing people together here on this set, virtually and actually. Hello, everybody, and thanks as well to Lawrence and Besma for joining us out of town. Let's start with this. Carmen, how do you want to define populism?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think it is a political response to injustice, perceived or real, that can be fueled by anger, by fear, and by emotion. And it is a political response to that to solve or save the nation from these threats or problems.
Besma, what would you add to that?
Yeah, it's a great definition, although I just add that I think it's also this dichotomy between what's perceived as the pure people, quote unquote, and the corrupt elite. It's not quite an ideology. Some refer to it as a thin ideology. The definition I like, or the way to perceive it, is really thinking of it as a form of rhetoric. It's the narrative that people use, particularly politicians.
Lawrence, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I like the way Bestman put it, and I would simply add that it's more an attitude or an approach than it is a political philosophy. And because almost all politicians talk as if they were representatives of the people, at least part of the time, it's hard to isolate it from other elements of politics that occur from time to time in many countries.
Besma, it's often the case that when we hear media personalities or commentators opining about populism, it's often bound up with terms like xenophobia, nativism. It's not meant to be a positive thing. How much, in your view, is populism bound together with all of those other sort of more nefarious elements?
So yes, I think populism generally, and particularly by academics, is kind of seen in a very derogatory sense. So it does come kind of with a loaded sense. Does it have to be xenophobic? No. Does it have to be nativist? No. But those are many of the characteristics that you would see among populism. And one of the things that's really important about populism is you have to really understand the context in which it appears. And it's very context dependent. We do see some kind of patterns or commonality currently, and again, it's very much the specific moment. It's mostly on the right wing, and so in the right wing sense, yes, there is quite a lot of alignment on these kind of nativist views, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, certainly. Even I would say lots of views on environment, gender, immigration, a lot of the cultural stuff, certainly. But more broadly, I think it's has to be figured out in terms of what country are we talking about, because that may not present itself in a different context, different country, or different leader.
Well, that's interesting in as much as, Lawrence, when I was a kid, populism was always a thing of the left wing, right? The NDP was very much a populist movement that emerged from the prairies in Canada. I guess it's not still the case that populism is a left-wing thing on this continent, is it?
No, but again, I think the political science literature on the concept argues that it can come from the right or the left, and that depends a little bit on the context and the timing. I mean, we had the progressives in Canada in the 1920s and a number of European countries right now, particularly Spain and Greece. You find populist parties that are on the left, but you also find others that are on the right, as in Austria or the Netherlands. So it's compatible with different ideologies, but the essential a core element, I think, which has already been mentioned by everybody along the way here, is the idea of the people versus the establishment, us versus them. And what gives it its negative connotation is you need a them. And when politicians start to blame the them for everything that's wrong in the society that they live in, that's when it takes on that negative connotation. So let's blame the immigrants, or let's blame big business, as a left party might do, or and the minute you get that us and them framing, depending on who's making the argument and in what context, you get a kind of a populist politics, and it might be sporadic. I think one of the things we'll get to eventually is that the rise of populism in many places has come very suddenly, including in Canada when social credit popped up in the 30s or reform in the 90s. Those really came on us very, very quickly, and we didn't see them coming. Nobody saw social credit in Quebec coming in the 1960s. So you got a context and a leader that came together in that particular place and time and made those kinds of arguments.
Well, let's do a real-life example, Carmen. How about the Freedom Convoy in the nation's capital? Was that a populist movement?
It was a movement that was based on conspiracy theories, on hate, on ideologies. Also, some people just responding to the mandates, but we did see politicians respond to that in different ways, right? We saw some parties, like the People's Party of Canada, using some of the conspiracy theories as their platform in that federal election. So we see the engagement with politicians with, using terms and language that conspiracy theorists or people who are against the elites can hear and trigger them and think that that politician is their voice at the pulpit of politics. But we also see politicians gainfully involving in this and saying, well, what are the other parts of fears that are a part of this, and how can we justify that or change those sense of injustice in our policies and our platforms? So yes, there was populism absolutely there, and there was a populist response from politicians.
Just follow up on that, if you would. What do you think? I mean, it was quite a toxic brew of things that came together that caused the convoy to take over the nation's capital for as long as it did. What was in that toxic stew, if you like?
Well, it was an interesting movement that started online, and people were talking about their fears and their engagement, and that's how they became part of the conversation, right? That's how they socialized. And in that, what we saw was this confluence of all these different groups coming together, expressing different opinions about why it was happening or how it was going to manifest in the end. And so all these ideologies came together, but we also had people who wanted to create a coup. We had people who were using this very far-right extremist groups to spread their hate ideology through conversations and memes and through GIFs and things that they were putting online. So we saw this milieu come together that had one thing in common, which was distrust in the government, and that distrust in institutions with media, government, all focused together and brought these groups together in a milieu that tried to find a response to this. And then we started seeing politicians engaging to say, well, how can we best benefit from this to get power? So,
well, yeah, let me follow up with Lawrence on that, because clearly some politicians, the former prime minister being one of them, were very much against the convoy. They ended up bringing in laws to really make it difficult for the convoy members. But, some conservative politicians went down there. Pierre Poilievre was one of them, I think, took some pictures with some members of the convoy. I guess I want to know, Lawrence, from you, is it okay, I don't know, should politicians be insinuating themselves in those circumstances when populism gets a little nutty? And by that I meant there were times that the convoy members were suggesting that the police ought to basically go tell the Governor General to dismiss the Prime Minister. I think you said basically launch a coup. Everybody's for populism when it's sane, but that seemed a little insane at the time.
Yeah, I was setting up to give a sort of a typically academic yes and no answer to the way you framed the question, because the convoy to me was a kind of a fringe movement. It never had broad popular support. So it wasn't going to lead anywhere politically in Canada. But, and when the People's Party, which sort of grew out of that, tried to politicize it, they didn't have much success with it. So I don't think that every movement of any kind that takes place on the fringe, especially in a context like the COVID, which was an exogenous kind of factor in politics, is necessarily going to lead anywhere. And the politicians who tried to pick up on it and use it, as Bernier did to some extent, didn't have much success. So that leads us back to the fundamental question of what is the future of populism in Canada? It's not the convoy, but there could well be a future, as we see from examples in some of the other countries.
Well, Besma, I'm just wondering, like, what were we supposed to make of this request by convoy members to have the Governor General dismiss the Prime Minister? I wasn't quite sure on what grounds, but you know, you want to take these things seriously because you know the people behind them, behind these requests, are being serious in the way that they approach issues. But that just seemed kind of wacky. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, I think I agree that it was wacky, partly because I don't even think it was constitutional. I'm not an expert in the Constitution, but I recall that. And certainly, I think this ease of which things can be done is very, very populist-like. I mean, they see things in this very simplistic worldview, absolutely see things in terms of these binaries. Again, you know, looking at the government as you know, the source of all ills and problems, and also seeing them in terms of, you know, wanting to control. Again, the conspiracy theory, as Carmen pointed out, it makes this really a bit more wacky because, as you recall, this was all about this idea that the COVID vaccine was going to implant something that was going to control their minds, and 5G towers were complicit in it. I mean, it really got pretty nutty once you start to drill down. But I think the core of this mistrust of government is what stands out to me. And the tools of which politicians today are able to use, things like social media. I mean, this is really for us, I think, in analyzing this, where you need to look to see how populists kind of find themselves, because that's the ease of which of political mobilization online that has created this like-minded, you know, group community almost thinking of government in a very negative way. And again, we all need to be critical of government. I'm certainly not one that thinks, as a political scientist at least, that we should give government a pass. On the contrary, but this very core idea that government is trying to control us, control our minds, control our bodies, it's excessive. And I think that really resonates with a lot of populists who really feel that the government is not serving the interests of the people. It is very much not just corrupted, but also morally bankrupt. Again, not just financially corrupt, you know, for personal gain, which I think we can all agree is prevalent in all societies and systems, but this idea that they're morally corrupt. They're trying to create a morally bankrupt society, which is very prevalent on the right wing currently in the populist movements. It really stands out and kind of makes us a bit wacky.
In which case, Carmen, tell me whether you think, what's your sense about whether or not the convoy, which may have been, compared to the Canadian population, relatively small in numbers, but did their views represent a bigger chunk of the population than maybe some of us thought?
I think that at that point people were afraid, and it's based on emotions. And when you start engaging with conspiracy theories and these ideas, that distrust doesn't dissipate. So whatever distrust in institutions existed during the convoys has expanded as the conversations have continued, as conspiracy theories and populism and response to ideas that are happening around the world. The internet is borderless. So the ideas that are being shared about this distrust and elitism and what could potentially be a sense of control or what they're trying to do to the people is not just confined within Canada. So we see those ideas spreading internationally. I think that many of the people who were influencers or part of the engagement of the convoys have changed that narrative to now it's a much larger, broader picture. We see them picking up some of the ideas of distrust in the elections that we just had, right? That it was fake or it was rigged or that the media did these things.
Relatively small number.
But when we actually look at what happened in the election with Poilievre's numbers and Trudeau's numbers, I don't think that we can definitely say at this moment, oh, we won, it's fine, and these ideas have dissipated,
sorry, you mean Poilievre and Carney?
Sorry, Carney, sorry.
Right, okay.
I have Trudeau in my mind today, obviously. When we think about that, we can't just ignore those ideas. I mean, jumping on something that Lawrence said was that, Heritage 2025 and Project 2025 from the Heritage Foundation, that is something that has been stemming since the 1940s in America with the Heritage Front and this movement and people engaged in groups like the John Birch Society, right? They've been dismissed. So when we dismiss these ideas of wackiness or it's salacious, we're not really looking at the injustice that they're perceiving underneath and engaging with it. And it hurts us in the future when we look at what's happening in 2025.
Let's go down memory lane for a second here. I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to play a clip from something we did on this program a few years ago. Paul Somerville co-authored a book called Reclaiming Populism: How Economic Fairness Can Win Back Disenchanted Voters. And Paul's take on this it's pretty fascinating. He's a former Bay Street economist who ran for the NDP and ran for policy chair of the federal Liberals. So he's got an interesting background for a Bay Street economist. And here's what he had to say about some of what we're discussing right now. Sheldon, if you would.
There's a very specific group of people who are anti-vax, who are anti-mandate, have certain grudges against government. But our argument would be that once the blockades are dismantled, that this will fade as a memory in Canada. We're not going to see some political realignment that's going to create the kind of political disruption, institutional disruption that we've seen in the United States and in the UK.
Lawrence, 3 years later, in your view, how does that prediction look?
That's absolutely right. And that's why, going back to something I said earlier, I wouldn't pick the convoy as my example of a populist movement, but we could get populist movements in Canada nevertheless. And the reason the convoy didn't work in the COVID context, politically that is essentially that the Canadian public was very supportive of a lot of the COVID restrictions. The polling of that time shows that pretty clearly. So it's not that you had the people, as we would call it in populist language, moving over to the side of the convoy. They were pretty much aligned the other way.
Paul's view, though, Besma, was that, we hear so much that's pejorative about populism, and he very much wants to take that kind of spirit of indignation and spirit of reform and channel it towards more constructive means, particularly by the elites who are in charge of many of the levers of power in this country. Do you agree that in principle, that's a good thing for us to try to do?
I mean, in principle, the fact that we have, an educated, informed citizenry who wants to change government for the better, yes, absolutely. But I think there are these nefarious things underpinning a lot of populism that I think we need to be really careful about. Certainly, there is a lot of xenophobia, a very strong anti-immigrant perspective, very gendered. I mean, we don't talk about this enough, but populism has a really strong gendered undertone. And part of that is, they look at a lot of times that the courts and institutions are the ones that are on a moral agenda to bankrupt society. And part of the simplicity and romanticization of the past, which is prevalent across a lot of populist movements, is kind of, the alpha male, going back to the 1950s when things were simple. Again, very anti-feminist movement, if you will. Again, connotations of The Handmaid's Tale is not wrong here, because I think that's the fear of many who sort of watch this kind of dialogue. And that is really troubling. I don't think we can say it's, a movement that is just raising awareness and political mobilization amongst the people. There's something really problematic here, for racial minorities, for sexual minorities. There's a lot of fear here in what is coming out of this messaging. And I'm afraid, again, going back to social media, I'm going to harp on that because I really think it's, the way to really discover this is to see what's happening on social media. We have a medium today that just caters to the simplistic, caters to the bombastic, the charismatic, the simplicity of, remember how great things were, the time of our parents and, grandparents, things were so simple, just that simplification of life and romanticizing of the past, for a lot of people, the past is not necessarily a positive one. I mean, the way we treated our Indigenous communities, our Black communities, one can go on and on. It is not a pretty picture when you talk about the past. So again, there's a lot to be unearthed here. And I think looking at how the leaders of today can take populism to a really dangerous tone through social media and the virality of it is something we can't dismiss.
It seems, Carmen, that Bestma's observation that this is a very gendered movement, that this is, I mean, the guys are behind this. On the other hand, Tamara Lich, I mean, she was one of the leaders of this thing. I don't think I'm saying her last name properly. It's probably Leach, but anyway. I mean, she was charged. She went to court. She was clearly one of the faces of the convoy, and she's a woman.
Yes.
So you want to say that you can't really say this is 100% a male thing.
It's not. I mean, I think when we think about the gendered ideals of this, we have to look at it in a much bigger picture. So there are women, and there have been women who have been on the right who want to. I mean, if we think about Phyllis Schlafly in America, right? Women who want to return to this nostalgic idea of what the 1950s were. The problem about nostalgia is most of the people asking for it weren't alive. It is really a critique of our current times. Women engage with this. We see the trad wife movement that we were talking about earlier, where women are trying to do that simplistic sort of be at home, be submissive kind of idea. But what they're sharing with that are populist ideas, which include moral panics that are anti-feminism, that are anti-sexual gender minorities, that are against and xenophobia and racist base. Women can articulate this, but men are definitely, the sort of heroes in this idea. What we're looking at now online is this idea of people men who have this constructed victimhood idea that they're being oppressed by feminism, by sexual gender minorities. And that's being articulated through nostalgic ideas about politics, about controlling women's rights, hurting communities with policies. So women are engaged in this, but predominantly is men, as we saw in the States with the Theo Bros, who are powering this, and the podcasters who engage in this constructed victimhood.
Lawrence, let me ask you a direct question about one of the better-known politicians in our country today, who he garnered a great deal of attention simply by doing an interview with a reporter who was asking about this while he was chomping down on an apple. And some people thought that that was a fantastic moment for him, and other people thought it was him being very dismissive and rude. In your view, Pierre Poilievre, is he a populist leader?
No, he uses populist rhetoric from time to time, as many politicians do. But an effective populist leader has to come from the outside somewhere. And most of them, like Trump or Berlusconi, for example, came from the business community, and they built their political movement on the theme that they were outsiders who were going to fix a broken system or confront the special interests or the politicians who were untrustworthy. Poilievre is the opposite, really. He's a career politician who's spent most of his adult life in Parliament. So he's not well placed to be a populist. I think he's ambitious. I think he's kind of realized that. And I could go into a lot more detail about the last election. But he was really trying, now having to confront Carney in the election, trying to restructure their campaign and reorient it. But he simply didn't have enough time to do that given the context. But I think if he's able to hang on to the leadership, you're going to see him move in a couple of new directions and a little bit more cautiously toward a more traditional opposition role. And I would make that same point about some other politicians in Canada that have been considered populist. Take a Doug Ford, for example. He came into politics as an outsider, winning the leadership of his party against an establishment candidate. He came from a background with his brother having been mayor of Toronto that had a good, strong populist orientation to it. But he's pretty much set that aside, and he's become a pretty conventional conservative premier of Canada's largest province, and he realizes that, and he wants to be premier. I think Danielle Smith right now in Alberta is going through a very similar transition. And if we look further abroad, you'll see leaders like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who ran with her party as a populist candidate, a new party, an outsider, who was going to fix the long-standing political divisions in Italy. And as soon as she got into power, she made peace with the European Union, and she's become a part of the conservative European establishment. She has very good relationships with Ursula von der Leyen and other European politicians. So all politicians are not the same, but I would expect to see Poilievre follow a route more like that. He's not going to get up on the convoy and try to use those people as his ticket to power.
Bestma, I suspect if Doug Ford were here, he would be the first to tell you that the kind of radical, obnoxious populism he performed in the first year of office If he'd kept that up, there's no way he would have won 3 majorities in a row. Yes, Lawrence is quite right. He's kind of figured out a way to bevel his edges. But do you agree with Lawrence that if to be considered a genuine populist politician, you've got to be seen to be an outsider, and therefore Pierre Poilievre is not?
I mean, I agree with a lot of what Larry said, but there's just, I think, some, if I may just add a bit more flavor. I think what we need to we need to sort of emphasize here is that these leaders may not necessarily really drink the Kool-Aid and believe, the populist rhetoric, but they use the rhetoric in their campaigns and in their sloganeering. And so, that's why, again, we're not psychologists, so we're not going to know whether or not these people really believe it, but they're using it. It's a tool. Populist rhetoric is what really kind of connects all these people. I mean, again, we talked about Maloney, for example. Larry mentioned that. Maloney went on this whole traditional values issue, the Catholic Church. I mean, she's a single mom. Right? And she does not necessarily fit the mold of a traditional family value, yet she was up there on the pulpit really actually, professing this. So, these, again, look at Trump. I mean, he talks about being against the swamp. I mean, you can't get more swampy than New York real estate. I mean, there's just something really weird about these leaders, standing, outside and suggesting that somehow they're not a part of this system. Again, I think Poilievre, there are some things that do sound very much like a populist rhetoric. He uses the rhetoric, and there's even, dare I say, some of the performative aspects of populism that you can tell in his tone. And I remember Poilievre when he wasn't necessarily leader or wasn't the leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, some of his views on monetary policy were very odd and did fit that kind of populist view of taking things back from the elite. And yet, I agree with Larry. He's a career politician. I don't think he had another job outside of being a politician. But the fact that he's never been in power is he's able to use the populist rhetoric that the government is the governing government. And so therefore, he's not a part of that group of elite.
Well, of course, he was in power for a little while when he was a cabinet minister in Stephen Harper's government. So, again, to Lawrence's point, not exactly an outsider when you've been in the cabinet of the government of Canada. I just wonder, Carm, what do you think? I mean, Mark Carney did win the biggest chunk of votes in the last election, but he only got 1.5 points more than Pierre Poilievre, and based on the splits, he was lucky to. Well, not lucky. I mean, that's the system we have, and the numbers fell well for him. Do you think there's anything he can do to build bridges to voters who are more populist in their orientation and, for whom he wants to show that he represents everybody and not just the 43% that voted for him?
I think that we do, and this might sound salacious, but I do think that we have to address some of these ideas that people perceive as being the injustice of what is happening. Although it won't come through being on TVO or being on CBC, perhaps engaging in media that is podcasts. I'm not saying going on Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, but engaging with that audience about those topics with a little bit of transparency. I think most importantly, what we need to do is actually start holding people accountable for what they're saying, what they're doing, and what they're engaging with. I think that when we think about, I'm going to pick on Poilievre here, but when we think about some of his conversation that was part of the Jordan Peterson ideal, where if you and I were just watching it, we would think that conversation meant nothing. But to the people that I research who are very much in his court in this politician election, were language of, almost picturing this idea of a white picket fence and 2.5 children and the typical white parents who are running and going back to this idea of, is there racism in Canada? And talking about this nostalgic idea that might sound idyllic, but really feeds into our groups. So when we talk about that, we can't just not hold people accountable for those. What exactly did he mean? Ask those questions. When we start name calling or we start engaging with things that have a hint of conspiracy theory to it, we should engage with that and ask questions about it. Not just media, but also the constituents, people engaging in this. I think it's a much larger picture that has to be involved in this. And I think that distrust is not going to dissipate like that for Carney or for the Liberal Party or the NDP at that matter. So I don't think it's a simple answer that we can have, but I think it's something we have to start engaging with and start exploring.
Well, that tees me up for a good final question for Lawrence here, because we're down to our last minute, and that is, we've seen examples of populists get elected. Some, like Doug Ford, bevel their edges. Some, like Donald Trump, double down and are on steroids. Which is more effective, ultimately?
Well, if by effective you mean staying in office, obviously the first examples, the Danielle Smiths or the Doug Fords. But I would go back to what we were just talking about. I liked what Carmen had to say. Carney is going to have a tough time in this semi-populist world that we live in today. He personifies the political establishment, you know, a former banker. And every time I see him, I just sort of envision how the public is perceiving him or how they're going to perceive him a year or two down the road. He's made a lot of promises that are going to be very, very difficult to deliver on, at least in the shorter term. Maybe he'll build this fantastic economy that he talks about, but even if he does, that's going to be 2 or 3 election cycles from now. So I can just imagine what it's going to be like with Carney trying to deliver as the new prime minister, and Poilievre, assuming he remains opposition leader, will have an ideal populist kind of target in his sights. And I think he will begin to use the populist rhetoric again against Carney somewhere down the road.
Gotcha. Mr. Director, can I have a 3-shot, please, so I can thank all of our guests for appearing on the agenda. Besma Momani from the University of Waterloo and CG. Lawrence Leduc on the other side of the screen from the University of Toronto. And in the middle, keeping the peace, is Carmen Celestini, University of Waterloo as well. It's great to have you three with us tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Members of the Canadian chapter of a group called Patriotic Millionaires believe the wealthy should contribute more in taxes, and they're hoping they can change minds and policies. How would their approach change conditions in this country? And can they actually convince other well-heeled Canadians to follow their lead? Let's dig in with, in Los Angeles, California, Sabina Vora-Miller, public health scientist and co-founder of the Vora-Miller Foundation. She's also a board member of Patriotic Millionaires Canada. From Galiano Island, British Columbia, Emma Davis, nonprofit administrator and member of Patriotic Millionaires Canada. And with us here in the studio, Dylan Dussault, nonprofit and policy advocacy professional and the inaugural executive director of Patriotic Millionaires Canada. Dylan, good to have you in that chair. And to Emma and Sabina and Points Beyond, we thank you for joining us on TVO tonight as well. Dylan, just get us started here by telling us how this organization started.
Sure thing. So the first version of Patriotic Millionaires started in the U.S. about 15 years ago. It was in response to then President Obama considering extending the Bush tax cuts for millionaires. It was a sign-on letter of wealthy people in the U.S. who said, for the good of our country, raise our taxes. It got a huge amount of media attention. It spun out into its own organization. We formed a chapter in the UK about 4 or 5 years ago, and earlier this year we formed the Canada chapter and recruited the inaugural membership for that.
And Emma, tell us about how the Canadian chapter came into being here. What was the push for that?
Well, I think what we're seeing in Canada is, like we're seeing in most Western nations, we're seeing a consolidation of wealth in a smaller and smaller percentage of citizens. And just like the other Patriotic Millionaires chapter, there's a need in Canada for a different kind of taxation that moves some of this money back into the public purse.
Sabina, how did you get involved?
Yeah, I think for me was when we were talking about increasing the capital gains inclusion rate in Canada, and I, saw on social media, specifically on Twitter, people were very vocally speaking out against it. And I think that was the time when I decided I needed to join this chapter, talk about why we really need to, as a public health scientist, why we actually need to be increasing the things like taxation rates. We need to be making sure there is equal representation with respect to how much money we're actually giving back into the systems, the infrastructure that we are using. And that's really what got me to join this organization.
Emma, let's make sure we understand what a millionaire is, because, of course, if anybody owns a home in Vancouver or here in Toronto, where the average price of a home is well north of $1 million, and if you own a home, does that make you a millionaire and therefore of interest to this organization?
So Patriotic Millionaires defines a millionaire as someone who holds more than $5 million in wealth, not including real estate. And I can tell you that the research is that there are about 90,000 Canadians with wealth over between $5 and $30 million. And then there are an additional 1,400 with wealth over $30 million.
So Dylan, what's your message for them?
Look, our message is no one in this country built wealth alone, right? Everybody relies on our infrastructure, our healthcare, our education systems to keep products moving, to keep the workforce healthy and educated. And it's up to the wealthy who have benefited the most from that system to pay more back into it. And fundamentally, there are pieces of our tax code right now that are going to guarantee wealth inequality keeps going, wealth keeps getting funneled towards the top, and we need to fundamentally change pieces of our tax code to make sure these people are paying back into the system and reinvesting in the system that helped make them wealthy.
Sabina, when you take that message to people who are worth $5 million, who are the targets of, shouldn't say targets, that sounds nefarious, who are of interest to your organization, what is the general reaction?
You know, I think there's a very small subset of the population who's vocally against them. But actually, we did a survey a couple of years ago when we surveyed 201 Canadians who fit, the threshold of patriotic millionaires. And we asked them, hey, if we were, suggesting increasing the tax rate, for instance, to address this cost of living crisis that Canadians are going through right now, would you actually be interested? Would you actually support this? And in fact, over 70% of Canadians who fit this bracket of patriotic millionaire categories said that, in fact, they would be in favor of increasing the tax rate. So if you actually look at the general population of rich Canadians in Canada, we are very supportive of this. But unfortunately, you just hear from that very small minority who are very loud about this, and they don't actually represent the rest of us. We see our friends, our neighbors, our teachers, our physicians, our, mail carriers. We see them all struggling, and we don't want our neighbors to be struggling. We don't want our friends to be struggling. And we know that, societies that are unequal are just simply not going to thrive. And taxing the rich actually leads to better outcomes for everyone. So why are we not doing it? And we all actually seem to agree on this, other than the few very select vocal minority.
Well, let me talk about that. You call them loud minorities, but okay, Emma, you take this on. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, takes a great deal of pride in saying that he's never raised a tax in the 7 years that he's been in power. I don't know if that's actually true, but that's what he says. There are people who believe there's nothing patriotic about paying more tax. In fact, you can talk to people who are very happy to tell you that it's actually unpatriotic to pay more tax and we should all be trying to pay less tax. What's your take on that?
Well, I guess I would speak to that maybe from my personal experience. When my family's wealth situation changed, it didn't change my belief that there's a level of wealth that's too much. It's damaging to society and democracy. I think we all know most Canadian wealth is built on a legacy of inequality. There are all kinds of systemic privilege underpinning who gets wealthy, and we have an obligation to right those scales. The fact that I got lucky and ended up with a disproportionate amount of wealth doesn't somehow qualify me to decide how it should be spent or where the greatest or most pressing needs in society are. And I think taxation really is our best tool for addressing inequality. I'm a really big fan of democracy. We have a system for making fair decisions about where resources are most needed and prioritizing the highest needs. And it isn't a perfect system, but government spending is the only method we have for collective decision making about distributing resources.
Dylan, is there something patriotic about paying more in tax?
Look, I think it's a responsibility you have to your country, right? You have to vote, you have to serve on juries, and you have to pay taxes. And I think, we believe that the people who have gotten the most out of this system should be paying the most into it. It is a patriotic reinvestment.
You know they are already.
I know, but not at the rate, right? If we're talking about the rate of their wealth to what they're paying in taxes, you're paying more as an average working Canadian who's paying taxes off your paycheck than people who primarily make their money off of capital gains or amassing properties, per se.
Sabina, what about just encouraging this group of millionaires to be more patriotic by being more philanthropic? What about that idea?
Look, we obviously have a philanthropic organization. I believe strongly in philanthropy. But here's the thing, why should I be deciding where funds are going? Philanthropy, unfortunately, depends on the whims of rich people, what they're passionate about, what they want to put money into. And if you actually look at the stats, you will see that very small number of organizations get bulk of the funding, right? And that's not an equitable way of distributing funds. The way that we do it with taxation not only allows us to be able to distribute this this equitably. But also the key part is governments can scale like no one else can, right? That is the key point over here. So yes, people should be, donating their money. They should be putting it in. And in fact, actually, there's data to show that most rich people give away very, very little amounts of their personal wealth. So let's tax them, make sure that they're actually giving that money to the government so that they can take on these big projects that philanthropy can simply not do it alone.
Well, Dylan, let's get specific here. There are a lot of different kinds of taxes that people watching and listening to this pay.
Sure.
Which ones would you like to see go up?
Look, I think the fundamental problem with the tax code right now is how we favor wealth and assets over income, right? If you make money from a paycheck, you are going to be paying a higher tax rate than people who make money from buying and selling stocks.
The
or
Oracle
investing
of
in real
Omaha has
estate.
been saying that for years.
Exactly. So, I think that's a fundamental problem we need to address. And that is changes to how we tax capital gains. That is considering wealth taxes. That's looking at doing asset registries to make those effective. And that's also combating tax evasion and avoidance, right? Which is a lot of tools really only available to the extremely wealthy, narrow set of the population that have access to a lot of lawyers and accountants that can help them hide or restructure their wealth to avoid or evade taxation. And we need to address those loopholes as well.
Well, okay, Emma, let's get specific here. Everybody, except the most low income among us, because they can get a rebate, but pretty much everybody pays the goods and services tax when they purchase a good or a service in this country. Should that tax go up?
I don't think that the GST tax is a focus of Patriotic Millionaires platform at this time. We're looking at closing tax loopholes. We're looking at tax rates for the wealthiest Canadians. There's no inheritance tax in Canada. These are the kinds of things that we're focused on right now.
So I take it then that when one of Mark Carney's first gestures when he became Prime Minister was to reverse the previous government's capital gains exemption, you were against that.
I was pretty vocally in support of that as a very beginning of more fair taxation in Canada, and I was really sad to see the Liberal government toss that out.
Sabina, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I was pretty vocal even on Carney's social media pages, and I actually got massively targeted by those who were anti-tax increase. But I disagree with that. I think that there are definitely very easy ways for us to make sure that we are able to put money back into public systems. We need it for our healthcare. It's crumbling right now across Canada. We need it for our education. We need it for our infrastructure. Housing is a massive issue. How are we going to solve all of these critical issues that every Canadian is currently facing? This is the best way to do it.
Dylan, when you call up the government of Ontario or the government of Canada and you say, we've got these ideas and we want to share them with you and your officials, what's the reaction?
Look, I think people are often happy to hear that there is a group of wealthy people that is interested in reinvesting this economy, is not necessarily interested in just hoarding wealth like a fairy tale dragon, right? People are excited to hear that. We are going to be having an event actually tomorrow in Ottawa focused on this and how Canada can use its leadership as host of the G7 to push this agenda internationally. And so I think, we are starting that engagement with the new government. We're excited to see where it goes and what the future holds. And we'll know more soon.
Tell me about the event tomorrow in Ottawa.
Sure. We are co-hosting it with Oxfam Canada and Quebec and Canadians for Tax Fairness. It is a panel event focused on how Canada can use its leadership as host of the G7. If you look at what happened at the last G20, Brazil was able to use its leadership as host of that to really push an agenda forward on how countries can work cooperatively to tax extreme wealth. And we believe that Canada should be kind of filling a big global leadership vacancy at the moment and pushing this agenda forward and using it to combat kind of extreme levels of inequality and especially on tax evasion and avoidance. These are big international problems that need to be worked on collectively.
Do you know if anybody from the Liberal government will be attending your event?
Yeah, I think we are going to have a lot of people, staffers from Finance Canada, members of Parliament, including people from the Liberal Party will be attending.
Okay. Emma, here's the thing. We've seen other countries, and I guess France was sort of a very good example of this, who tried to put a tax on the richest citizens, and the reaction seemed to be two different things. Some, like Gerard Depardieu, just left the country entirely. Others were so clever in the way they reorganized their finances that the Ministry of Finance didn't get nearly the yield in taxes that they thought they'd get from targeting, taking an interest in higher income people. I wonder if that's not a problem for this organization, in as much as the people you want to get the money from are the people who have the money to hire very good accountants to show them how not to pay more money.
Sure. Well, this is why part of the Patriotic Millionaires platform is international cooperation on these issues. This is an issue for Canada and for Canadians to talk about their domestic tax policy, but it's also part of an international conversation, which is why the work at the G7 is so important. There are ways that we can tax and write policy in Canada that will reduce the risk of flight. I think there's also an opportunity to make to work on that internationally and find solutions to that do make it less of a temptation. That said, I do think that one of the reasons rich folks choose to live in Canada, they have choices, they can move, they can go to other places. One of the reasons that people choose to live in Canada is that it's a great place to live. And that's going to continue to be true even if you're going to lose a little bit more of your wealth in taxation. And so I think that that's a little bit of a bogeyman.
I hear you, but Sabina, let me follow up with this. And in fact, I do hear from people who say, we do love raising our kids in Canada. This is a much better country than, for example, our friends to the south, particularly right now, to raise a family in, etc. However, I do hear the other side, which is, I'm trying to run a business here. The regulations are crazy. I'm paying too much in tax. And if they do one more thing to me, I'm out of here. What do you say to those folks?
Yeah, I mean, look at me. I'm living right now in California, but I'm coming back to Canada. I'm moving back to Canada. But here's the thing, right? Rich people can live wherever they want to live. But why would we want to live in a place that does not have good infrastructure, that does not have good schools, that does not have good, public health or healthcare systems? The bottom line is people want to live in places that actually have these amazing facilities and capabilities, right? If you actually look at the data, some of the most livable places in the world are places that have high taxes, because there is data to show that, high correlation between higher taxes and better quality of life. So I do feel that if people decide to make that decision to leave, they're going to quickly realize that where they have decided to go for this is, does not pass the smell test. They're going to realize that's actually not where they want to live. I mean, look at California, right? Where is all the tech in the world coming from? It's coming from one of the most highest tax rate states in the U.S. People are still living over here. People are still choosing to start their businesses here in California. And it's the exact same thing. I personally don't. I mean, I've had these conversations with a lot of our friends, who are against this tax rate increase, et cetera. But when I ask them, I'm like, really, are you going to stop investing because you're going to make slightly less money, slightly less profit? Is that really a reality? And frankly, I think that's absolutely laughable.
Why are you moving back to Canada?
Because Canada is home. And you know what? I love the security that we have in our country. I love that we actually have laws that govern us. I actually love the fact that we have free healthcare in our country. I actually love the fact that people in Canada care about our neighbors. And that is exactly why we've come together, because we all love our neighbors and we want to make sure that while we are succeeding in life, our neighbors are also succeeding in life.
Dylan, anybody who heard you say Ottawa a few minutes ago will know you're not from Canada. You're from Florida, but you're moving to Canada.
I have moved to Canada.
You have moved. How come?
I'm a permanent resident in Canada. Look, this is where my wife and I wanted to raise our family and start our family. This is where, we wanted to be long-term, because we think this is a great country for all the reasons Sabina just outlined and more. And I think, that is a big message of Patriotic Millionaires Canada, right? This is a great place. It needs investment to stay a great place. The people who have gotten the most out of this great place should be investing the most back into it. And that's why I'm really enthusiastic to be here and be starting this chapter.
Are they paying you enough that you're in the crosshairs of this organization now and they're going to come after you?
No. Luckily, I am not fighting against my own self-interest here like our brave members.
Okay, good. Let's take a little walk down memory lane here. 7 years ago, was it 7? 6. 6 years ago, we had Brett House on this program. Brett was, at the time, I think, deputy chief economist for Scotiabank. He's now at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the U of T. And let's hear what he had to say about some of these issues. Sheldon, if you would.
One of the biggest needs I think we have to keep in mind is that Canada is traditionally a capital poor economy. We're a small population on a very big landmass, and to develop, we have always needed to bring capital in from abroad, and we want to ensure that our tax system continues to incentivize that rather than pushes it away.
So your concern is a wealth tax would have a chilling effect on money coming into the country and investing here?
It absolutely could.
Well, Emma, that's the fear. What do you say to him?
Well, I think as Sabina said earlier, I think that there are lots of reasons that people choose to live and invest in Canada. It's a great place to live. It's a country that takes care of its people. And those are first and foremost the reasons people choose to be here. People invest in the place that they live. That's how people make decisions about, where they want to see things get better. I just don't see that an increase on the wealthiest Canadians, we're not talking about your average Canadian here. I don't think an increase of taxation on the wealthiest Canadians is going to suddenly result in people leaving the country and taking their money.
You know, there's any number of different ways to get at this, obviously, but we have seen governments in the past flirt with the idea of, for example, putting a tax on yachts because average people do not buy yachts, or even potentially putting it on, six-figure cars because, it's unlikely you're going to be an average person and afford to spend more than $100,000 on a car. Sabina, what about those ideas? Just taxing so-called luxury products. Would that get you where you want to go?
I mean, I think that's definitely a start, right? That does put some money back into the public purse, but I don't think that's sufficient. I think that's one of the things we should be looking at because, again, if you actually look at how much money the Canadian rich folks have, I mean, the data says that the richest 1% control over a quarter of Canada's wealth, which amounts to $3.5 trillion. That's a lot of zeros, by the way, right? No one needs that much money. And I can tell you as someone who was a first-generation immigrant, I faced houselessness when I first came to Canada. And I'm in a situation now which is completely different. I can tell you that it is so easy for rich people to make more money, right? And here's the thing. People who are rich, who have this amount of money, are not going to realize they have slightly less money because they have so much money. No one needs that much money. If you actually look at the stats, last year, billionaire wealth in Canada grew by 309 million every single day. Meanwhile, we have over, 4 million Canadians in Canada who are living below the poverty line. That just does not make sense, right? So here's the thing. Yes, put taxes on things like yachts, on private airplanes, etc. But we need more than just that. And we can see what's happening in the US right now with those ultra-rich people. Not only are they rich, but they also now have influence and power. And they're making all these decisions for the entire country to benefit themselves. We have to make sure we don't get into that position.
Emma, I wonder what you thought during the last federal election campaign that just concluded back in April. I wonder what you thought when, I don't know if you watched the debate, but all of the candidates on that stage were basically competing with each other to see who could cut taxes more deeply and more broadly. What did you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was disappointed to see that. I think that there's a big difference between campaign promises and policies, and I think that doesn't mean there isn't an opportunity to continue the conversation. At a certain point, I really do think there has to be a conversation about how much is enough. I think that extreme wealth corrodes democracy. I think wealthy people have a disproportionately loud voice. We saw that after the capital gains inclusion rate was proposed to go up. And I think that at a national level, wealthy people they control social media platforms and traditional media outlets. I think that when people see extreme wealth resulting in a disproportionate political power, and they see that not everyone is paying their fair share, they lose trust in the democratic system and they can become disenfranchised. And I really think that at the end of the day, democracy is what we're all working to protect here.
Dylan, you told us that this organization exists already in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Yeah. What is the experience of, let's call it the success rate, that those organizations have had in those countries in getting governments to act in the way you want them to act?
Sure. I think it's obviously a bit of a mixed bag, right? I don't think that the current government, for example, in the U.S. is going to be particularly responsive to the wealthy people that are members of Patriotic Millionaires, because they have plenty of wealthy people in their ear every day who are really steering a lot of the conversation.
The problem, there may be patriotic millionaires in the United States, but there are also a lot of patriotic billionaires who are with Trump, and they don't want to pay more tax.
Sure. I don't know that I would call them patriotic billionaires, but that's your word.
Fair point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's plenty of that going on. I think in the UK, there's been some success. I think during President Biden's administration, we saw some pretty significant changes. And I think you've also seen a huge change in the shift of public opinion in the US and in the UK on what it means to tax extreme wealth, on what the dangers of extreme wealth inequality are. And I think, organizations like Patriotic Millionaires have played an important role in that.
Sabina, this feels like, at this moment, in the political zeitgeist, this feels like a very large boulder to push up a very steep hill. How are you finding it?
It is, but I think what we're trying to do over here is also make some noise, right? I think for me personally, I am just so disappointed to see only the ones who are against it speaking out loud and clear. And so I think if the more noise we make, the squeaky wheel gets, what's that? The squeaky wheel gets the deal, right?
Gets
That's
the
what
grease.
we're trying to do over here. Yes,
Squeaky
exactly
wheel
that.
gets
And
the
that's
grease.
that's it. And yes, there are challenges, but we're up for it. That's the whole point. We're fighting for our Canadian neighbors, right? And how can that not be invigorating? Absolutely is. As a first-generation immigrant, Canada means so much to me, and I want to make sure that, everything that I received when I moved to this country is what everyone else gets over here too, right? We have to be equitable. That's the only way we all actually thrive.
Okay, Emma, we've got a conservative government in Ontario, so I'm not sure what the chances are of having any of this happen here, but you've got an NDP government in British Columbia. Are they open to this message?
Well, I think that that's absolutely a conversation that we'll be having, and I think I'm lucky to live in a green riding, so I know I have the ear of Elizabeth May when we have these conversations, and I think it's really early days. Patriotic Millionaires is a new organization, so I think that the first thing is just to start reaching out and seeing what potential there is and what folks are open to talking about.
Gotcha. I want to thank the three of you for coming onto our program tonight and giving, if not equal time, at least some time to the other side of the argument when it comes to tax policy. Sabina Vora-Miller, who's on the left of the screen, Dylan Dussault, who's in the middle of the screen, and Emma Davis, who's on the right of the screen. They all represent a group called Patriotic Millionaires Canada. And as the word suggests, if you're making $5 million a year, if you've got that much disposable income lying around, they want you. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate you coming on to TVO tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, June the 10th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, since the U.S. clearly isn't, can the U.K. be the ally Canada needs? I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.